The ranch sat quietly on the edge of town, far enough from the busy streets that one could hear the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the cattle calling in the distance. It was the kind of place where a person could breathe deeply and feel the weight of the world slowly lift off their shoulders. For Mark and his wife Emily, this ranch was more than just land with a house and barns. It was their safe haven, a place where life felt simple, honest, and free from the noise of city drama. They had built their lives here with hard work, steady effort, and love for the land. Mark was the kind of man who preferred long days outdoors rather than sitting in an office. His hands were strong from years of lifting hay bales, fixing fences, and repairing tractors that always seemed to break down at the most inconvenient times. Emily, on the other hand, had a calm but commanding presence. She carried herself with quiet confidence, never needing to raise her voice to be respected. To most neighbors, she was just Mark's wife who helped run the ranch. But behind her easy smile and gentle tone was a woman who carried an important badge. Emily was the town's police chief, a position she had earned through years of dedication, discipline, and an unshakable sense of fairness. Interestingly, not many of the neighbors truly knew about Emily's role. She was not one to brag or put her title in front of people's faces. When she was home, she wore jeans, boots, and a work shirt like any ranch wife. She fed the horses, carried grain, and mucked stalls with the same steady rhythm as her husband. She wanted her ranch to feel like her escape from uniforms, radios, and official duties. So, when new people moved into the neighborhood nearby, Emily never introduced herself as chief of police. She just said, "Hi, I'm Emily. We live down by the ranch." That was enough for her. The neighborhood that bordered part of their ranch was controlled by an HOA, a homeowners association. Anyone who lived there had to follow a long list of rules: how tall their grass could grow, what color they could paint their fence, and even what kinds of holiday decorations could be put up. To Mark and Emily, the HOA world seemed far too fussy. They were glad their ranch was separate from it, though a small dirt road ran close to the property line where sometimes neighbors walked their dogs or jogged in the mornings. For the most part, things stayed peaceful. The neighbors would wave politely when they passed by, and Mark would sometimes give kids pony rides at community events. But there was one neighbor who didn't wave, didn't smile, and seemed determined to make her presence known. Her name was Linda, though nearly everyone in town quietly referred to her as the HOA Karen. She was the type who thrived on enforcing rules, even rules that weren't hers to enforce. She had a sharp voice, sharp eyes, and an endless supply of printed HOA papers that she carried around in a binder, like some kind of badge of power. Mark and Emily had tried to be polite when they first met her. They shook hands, invited her to come by for coffee, and explained that their ranch wasn't part of the HOA. Linda had nodded but didn't really listen. In her mind, anything she could see from her backyard was somehow under her control. The ranch's dirt road, the one that ran behind the neighborhood and led into Mark and Emily's pasture, became her favorite subject of complaint. She insisted it was community access and claimed the HOA had some sort of rights over it, even though county maps clearly showed it was private ranch land. At first, Mark just laughed it off. He had dealt with plenty of stubborn folks in his life, and he figured that if they stayed friendly, Linda would eventually move on to bother someone else. But Emily noticed something in Linda's eyes each time they crossed paths, a kind of determination to win, to control, to prove herself right. Emily stayed calm, but she also made mental notes. She knew from her police work that some people, when challenged, didn't back down. Instead, they pushed harder. One sunny afternoon, as autumn leaves started to scatter across the fields, Mark and Emily were unloading a delivery of hay bales. The truck had backed up right onto the dirt road at the edge of the ranch, leaving little room for anyone to pass. Emily stood on the bed of the truck, tossing bales down to Mark, who stacked them neatly against the barn wall. Dust swirled in the air, and both of them were sweating, but there was a sense of satisfaction in getting the work done together. That was when Linda appeared. She marched down the sidewalk from her house, binder in hand, her face already set in a frown. Her sharp heels clicked against the pavement as she came closer, and Mark could feel trouble before she even opened her mouth. "What is this?" she barked, pointing at the truck blocking the road. "You can't block community access like this." "It's against HOA rules." Mark wiped his forehead with his sleeve and answered calmly, "This isn't community access, ma'am. This is our ranch road. We'll be done unloading in about half an hour. Linda's face reddened. Don't you ma'am me. I know the rules. I've told you before. This road is for everyone in the neighborhood. You can't just park your truck here like you own the place. Emily climbed down from the truck, brushing hay from her jeans. Her voice was steady, almost gentle as she spoke. Linda, this is our private property. The HOA rules don't apply here. We're just doing ranch work. Once we're finished, the road will be clear. But Linda wasn't listening. She flipped open her binder and waved a sheet of paper in Emily's face. See this? Section 14, paragraph 3. No obstruction of pathways. I'm calling the police. Mark let out a short laugh, not mocking, just surprised. The police, he said. That's not necessary. But Linda was already pulling out her phone, her expression smug as if she had caught them breaking some grand law. She stepped a few feet away and began speaking loudly into the phone, making sure they could hear every word. Yes, I need police right away. We have people blocking a community road. They're refusing to move. This is a violation, and I want them cited. Emily and Mark exchanged a look. Mark raised an eyebrow, half amused and half exasperated. Emily's lips curved into the smallest smile, though she kept it hidden. She didn't like drama, but part of her knew this moment was about to take a very different turn. Linda thought she was bringing down the law, but she had no idea she had just called the cops on the chief herself. The phone call ended with Linda's dramatic sigh. As though she had just saved the entire neighborhood from danger, she slipped her phone back into her pocket, crossed her arms, and stared at Mark and Emily with a satisfied smile. Her stance said everything. She believed she had finally caught them, that the police would arrive, back her up, and force them to admit she was right. Mark bent down to pick up another bale, shaking his head. He wasn't the type to argue endlessly with people who didn't want to listen. Years of ranch life had taught him that some battles weren't worth fighting. But still, he felt a heat in his chest at the way Linda spoke to his wife. Emily, however, remained composed, her calmness unshaken even in the face of such bold arrogance. You didn't have to do that, Emily said softly, her voice steady. We told you already this is private property. Linda let out a laugh that carried more mockery than humor. We'll see about that. You can't just say it's yours and block everyone. When the officers come, they'll put an end to this nonsense. I know how the law works. Mark almost smiled at her words, but he stopped himself. If only she truly knew who she was speaking to. Emily didn't respond this time. She simply picked up another bale and carried it inside the barn, her boots crunching on the gravel with every step. Mark followed her lead. He could tell she wasn't interested in a shouting match, and honestly, neither was he. The best thing to do now was wait. The minutes ticked by slowly, and tension hung in the air like a storm cloud. Linda stood near the road, tapping her foot, looking up and down as if she couldn't wait for the sound of sirens. Her binder rested against her side, her fingers gripping it like a shield of authority. Every few moments she'd glance toward Emily, expecting some sign of nervousness. But Emily's face never changed. She was calm, her movements measured as though she had all the time in the world. Inside, though, Emily was quietly reflecting. She thought about how often she had dealt with people like Linda during her career. People who shouted the loudest when they felt powerless. People who clung to rules without truly understanding them. In uniform, Emily had seen far worse. Yet here, in her own backyard, it felt almost personal. But she reminded herself that patience often spoke louder than anger. Finally, the faint sound of tires crunching gravel reached them. A patrol car turned the corner, its lights flashing but siren silent. It wasn't racing like it would for an emergency. It was steady, cautious, responding to what they thought was a neighbor complaint. Another car followed behind, and then a third. Linda's face lit up. She raised her arms, waving to them as though she were the one in charge. Over here, she shouted. It's them right there. The first officer stepped out of his car. He was young, maybe mid-20s, and his eyes immediately widened when he saw Emily standing by the truck. He froze for just a second before catching himself, quickly adjusting his expression to neutral. The other two officers also paused, exchanging glances with each other. Linda, not noticing, marched right up to them, speaking in her loudest voice. These two are blocking our road. They refuse to move even when I told them it's against HOA rules. You need to write them up, give them a fine, something. We can't have people breaking the law like this. The young officer nodded slowly, though his eyes kept flicking toward Emily. He looked almost nervous, as if unsure of what to say. One of the other officers, a woman with her hair pulled back neatly, stepped closer. Her voice was calm, professional. "Ma'am, can you tell us exactly what happened?" "I just did," Linda snapped. "They parked this truck across the road, blocked community access, and refused to move it. It's a violation. I have it all here." She opened her binder again, flipping through papers like a lawyer about to prove her case. Section 14, paragraph 3. No obstruction of pathways. It's all written down. The officers stayed quiet for a moment. Then the female officer turned to Emily and asked gently, "Chief, do you want to handle this?" Linda blinked. The word hung in the air. She looked at the officer, confused. "What did you just say?" The officer glanced at her partner, then back at Emily. "Chief?" Emily finally stepped forward, brushing her hands against her jeans. Her eyes met Linda's, steady and firm. "I'm Emily Carter," she said clearly. "I'm the chief of police in this town." For a moment, time seemed to stop. Linda's mouth fell open slightly, her binder slipping in her grip. The words didn't register right away. She blinked, looked back and forth between Emily and the officers as if waiting for someone to tell her it was a joke. But the officers stood respectfully, their postures straightening, their faces now serious in the presence of their superior. Mark tried not to laugh. He had been waiting for this moment, knowing it would come eventually. He folded his arms across his chest, watching the color drain from Linda's face. "What?" Linda finally stammered. You're the chief? That's impossible. You're just his wife, unloading hay." Emily didn't flinch. "I am his wife, and I'm also the police chief. And this," she gestured toward the road, "is private ranch property. The HOA has no jurisdiction here. You've been told this before, but now I'm telling you directly, as both the landowner and as the chief, that this is not a violation of any law." The young officer stepped forward, his voice careful but firm. "Ma'am," he said to Linda, "calling 911 for something like this is not appropriate. Emergency lines are for real emergencies, not HOA disagreements. You've tied up resources that could have been needed elsewhere." Linda's face turned bright red. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words tangled in her throat. For the first time since she arrived, she seemed unsure of herself. Her binder hung loosely in her arms now, no longer a weapon of authority. She looked from officer to officer, searching for someone to take her side. But no one did. Emily's tone softened slightly, though it carried the weight of finality. "We don't want trouble with our neighbors, Linda, but you need to understand the boundaries. This ranch road belongs to us. If you have a concern, you can bring it up politely. But you cannot misuse the law to try and control what isn't yours." Mark stepped forward then, his voice calm, but with a firm edge. "We've been patient. We've tried to be neighborly. But this has to stop. You don't run this land, Linda." "We do." For the first time, Linda had no quick retort. She looked down at the ground, her lips pressed tight. The officers stood silently, waiting to see how she would respond. The power she once felt seemed to slip through her fingers like sand. Emily didn't press further. She simply stepped back, letting the silence speak for itself. She had seen it many times before. Sometimes the strongest message came not from shouting, but from standing firm, calm, and unshaken. Linda shifted uncomfortably, muttered something that sounded like, "I didn't know," and slowly turned back toward her house. The officers relaxed a little, exchanging quiet glances with Mark as if to say, "We're glad you handled that." They didn't need to escort Linda. She was already retreating, her binder hugged against her chest like a shield. As the patrol cars left, the ranch fell back into quiet again. The hay truck stood where it was, the barn half filled with stacked bales. Mark and Emily looked at each other, and this time both allowed themselves a smile. They hadn't asked for drama, but they had handled it. And while Linda had tried to bring the law against them, she had instead learned the truth. The law was standing right there in front of her the whole time. The days following the incident felt strangely calm around the ranch. The sun rose each morning, spreading golden light across the fields, and the rhythm of life carried on as usual. Mark fixed fences, tended to the cattle, and checked the irrigation lines that kept the pastures green. Emily rose early, feeding the horses before heading into town for her police duties. Outwardly, nothing had changed, but beneath the quiet surface, word of the confrontation had already begun to ripple through the neighborhood. Neighbors had seen the patrol cars lined up by the dirt road that afternoon. They had seen Linda standing with her binder and her finger pointed, and they had seen the officers stepping back with respect when Emily spoke. Small towns had a way of spreading news quickly, and soon, conversations whispered across backyards and along sidewalks carried the same surprising phrase, "Did you know the rancher's wife is the police chief?" At first, people didn't quite believe it. They were used to seeing Emily in boots with hay in her hair or dust on her jeans. She didn't look like the picture people carried in their heads of a police chief, someone they imagined in a crisp uniform with a stern face. But then confirmation came. A man from the neighborhood mentioned that he had once seen her at a town meeting, in uniform, speaking with authority. Another neighbor said he had noticed patrol cars pulling into the ranch driveway sometimes. Not as visitors, but with the kind of respect officers showed their superior. As the truth settled in, it created two kinds of reactions. Some neighbors felt proud and even reassured. They were glad that someone like Emily lived nearby, someone calm, strong, and fair. Others, however, felt embarrassed that they had misjudged her, embarrassed that they had believed Linda's constant claims about the road being community property. And then, of course, there was Linda herself, who had become the subject of more than a few chuckles whispered behind closed doors. For Mark, the whole situation was half amusing and half frustrating. He never liked drama, and he especially didn't like being the center of neighborhood gossip. But he also couldn't help but smile each time someone told him, "I didn't know Emily was the chief." He'd nod politely and say, "She doesn't like to talk about it much. She's just my wife at home." He knew Emily preferred it that way. Emily, on the other hand, carried on as if nothing had happened. She didn't brag, didn't lecture, and didn't hold grudges. When she drove home from work, she stopped to wave at neighbors the same way she always had. If someone asked about her job, she answered kindly but briefly, then turned the conversation back to ranch life. Still, she was aware that things had shifted. People looked at her a little differently now, not in fear but with a quiet kind of respect. Linda, however, had not taken the lesson easily. For a few days she stayed quiet. The binder that was once always tucked under her arm seemed to disappear. She passed by quickly on walks, avoiding eye contact with Emily or Mark. But her pride had taken a blow, and it didn't take long for that pride to harden into bitterness. One Saturday morning, as Mark was repairing the latch on a pasture gate, he noticed Linda standing by the sidewalk watching. She didn't say a word, but the look on her face said plenty. It wasn't anger exactly. It was the look of someone who felt humiliated and didn't know how to let it go. Mark chose not to engage. He tipped his hat politely and went back to work. Emily, who was watering the garden nearby, noticed too, but remained calm. She knew that some battles were better left unspoken, but the neighborhood had already changed in ways Linda couldn't control. Parents began telling their children, "Be respectful if you walk by the ranch. The police chief lives there." Joggers who once cut across the ranch road now paused, unsure if they were trespassing. And little by little, the couple felt the invisible weight of unwanted intrusion lifting. Still, the memory of that afternoon lingered. Emily thought about it often when she sat on the porch in the evenings. She replayed Linda's voice in her head the way she had declared, "I know the law," while waving HOA papers. Emily smiled quietly to herself at the irony. She had spent decades studying and enforcing real law, training officers, responding to emergencies, and guiding her department. And yet, here was a neighbor who thought a binder of neighborhood rules held more authority. Mark noticed those thoughtful moments. He knew his wife well enough to understand she wasn't angry, but she was reflecting. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in streaks of pink and orange, he asked her, "Does it ever bother you that people don't realize who you are until something like this happens?" Emily leaned back in her chair, her hands resting on her knees. "Not really," she said softly. "I don't need them to know. Titles don't matter here. What matters is how we live. If they respect me only because of my badge, then they don't really respect me. I'd rather earn it through kindness, through how we treat people." Mark smiled. "That's what makes you a good chief. And a good wife." The next week brought another test. Linda, determined not to lose face, began dropping hints in HOA meetings. She told others that the road issue was still unresolved, that technicalities existed. But by then, most neighbors had lost patience with her. One man raised his hand and said plainly, "Linda, we saw what happened. The road doesn't belong to the HOA. Let it go." Others nodded in agreement. For the first time, Linda realized her usual audience wasn't backing her. Meanwhile, the officers who had responded to the call spread the story among colleagues at the station. Not in a mocking way, but as one of those moments that police officers carry with them. They told it with a kind of proud chuckle. Chief's own neighbor tried to call us on her. Didn't even know who she was. Emily pretended to be annoyed when she heard the story repeated, but deep down she found it both funny and humbling. Life on the ranch carried forward. The hay was stacked, the animals cared for, and the peaceful days stretched one into the next. But beneath the calm, a subtle transformation had taken place. The neighborhood, once quick to listen to Linda's demands, now looked more carefully before accepting her words as truth. Emily and Mark hadn't set out to prove anything, but their patience, calmness, and quiet strength had done more than any argument ever could. And though Linda still walked with her head high, clutching her binder like armor, she knew in her heart that she had miscalculated. She had underestimated the quiet woman in boots, the woman she thought was just another ranch wife. The realization lingered in her like a stone she couldn't quite spit out. Mark and Emily, however, didn't carry bitterness. They carried on, knowing that respect born of truth would always outlast authority built on pride. And while the neighborhood buzzed with the memory of what had happened, the ranch remained the same, steady, strong, and quietly guarded by a woman whose strength spoke loudest when she said the least. The cool breeze of late afternoon swept across the ranch as Emily leaned against the porch railing, watching the horses graze in the pasture. Life felt calm again, but she knew deep down that Linda's pride hadn't let go. The silence from the neighbor wasn't a sign of peace. It was the kind of silence that comes before another storm. Emily had been a police officer long enough to recognize when someone was holding on to a grudge, waiting for a chance to strike back. Sure enough, the next test came only a week later. Mark was moving feed sacks from the truck into the shed when he saw a small group of neighbors gathered near the end of the road. Linda stood in the middle of them, binder tucked tightly under her arm, speaking with exaggerated gestures. Her voice carried loud and sharp, as though she wanted the entire ranch to hear her complaints. Mark placed the feed sack down carefully and narrowed his eyes. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but he knew trouble when he saw it. Emily soon stepped out of the barn, brushing dust from her hands. She followed his gaze and saw the group. A soft sigh escaped her lips. "They're at it again," Mark said quietly. Emily nodded. "Let's see what she's telling them this time." The two walked calmly toward the edge of the property. As they got closer, Linda's voice became clearer. "And that's why the HOA has rights to this road," she was saying, waving a paper in the air. "If we let them block it whenever they want, then what's next? Barns built across sidewalks? Trucks parked on lawns? We need order here, and I, for one, will not let chaos take over our neighborhood." A few of the neighbors shifted uneasily. Some looked doubtful, but others were nodding politely, either out of habit or fear of disagreeing with Linda. Emily stepped forward, her presence quiet but commanding. "Linda," she said evenly, "this has gone on long enough." The group turned toward her and the murmurs fell silent. Linda stiffened but tried to hold her ground. "I'm just explaining the rules to everyone. They need to know what's allowed and what isn't." Mark crossed his arms and spoke firmly. "You're explaining rules that don't apply here. This is ranch land, our land. The HOA doesn't own this road." Linda's face tightened. She turned back to the group, refusing to meet Emily's steady eyes. "Don't listen to them. They just don't want to follow the same rules as everyone else." Emily stepped closer, her voice calm but louder now so everyone could hear. "The truth matters here. This road belongs to the ranch. It is private property. The HOA rules end at your fence line, Linda. You have no authority on this land. And everyone standing here deserves to hear the truth, not half claims written in a binder." The neighbors looked at one another, whispers starting again. One man cleared his throat and asked, "So, it really is your property?" Emily nodded. "Yes, county records show it. This land has belonged to the ranch for generations. We respect our neighbors and we always will. But we will not be controlled by HOA rules that do not apply to us." Mark added, his voice steady but protective. "We've been patient. We've tried to let things slide. But enough is enough. We work this land every day. We live by honesty and respect. And all we ask in return is the same." Linda's cheeks flushed red. She clutched her binder tighter, flipping through pages as if hoping to pull out some magic proof. But her hands shook and the papers rustled without meaning. The group around her began to shift. their earlier uncertainty fading into quiet realization. One of the women in the group spoke gently, almost apologetically. "Linda, maybe you should let this go. If the land really belongs to them, then, well, you can't fight ownership." Linda spun toward her, eyes flashing. "So you're just going to take their side? After everything I've done to keep this neighborhood orderly?" The woman stepped back, startled by the sharpness in Linda's tone. Others frowned, their sympathy for Linda shrinking quickly. Emily didn't need to raise her voice or argue further. She simply stood tall, her calm presence speaking louder than Linda's noise. Finally, one of the men folded his arms and looked directly at Linda. "I was there the day the police came. I saw how the officers acted toward her." He nodded toward Emily. "They called her chief. That told me all I needed to know. She knows the law better than any of us. If she says this is her land, then it is." That statement settled over the group like a heavy truth. The whispers stopped, and the silence that followed was thick with finality. Linda's shoulders sagged, and for the first time her binder seemed useless in her arms. She looked smaller somehow, her authority shrinking in the presence of truth. Emily softened her tone. "Linda, we don't want to be your enemy. We want peace. But respect goes both ways. You can't keep trying to control something that isn't yours. If you continue, you'll only hurt yourself in the eyes of the people around you." Linda opened her mouth as if to argue, but no words came. The group was no longer nodding along with her. They were looking at Emily and Mark with respect, nodding in quiet agreement. Mark took Emily's hand gently, a small but powerful gesture. "We're not going anywhere," he said firmly. "And neither is this ranch." With that, the couple turned back toward their home, leaving the group to process what had just happened. The neighbors slowly dispersed, some shaking their heads, others exchanging quiet words. Linda stood alone, binder clutched tight, her face pale with frustration and defeat. Back at the porch, Emily sank into her chair, exhaling slowly. "That might finally be the end of it," she murmured. Mark chuckled softly. "You handled it better than I ever could have. You didn't even need to shout." Emily smiled faintly. "Shouting never wins people's respect. Truth does." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the horizon in hues of orange and purple, a sense of closure settled over the ranch. The boundaries had been drawn clearly, not with anger, but with calm strength. And for the first time in weeks, Emily felt the weight lift from her shoulders. Linda had tried to use rules, papers, and pride to assert power. But in the end, she had been met with something stronger, the quiet authority of truth, dignity, and respect. And as the crickets began to sing and the stars blinked awake, Mark and Emily knew their ranch would stand firm, not only against weather and work, but also against the storms of pride and misunderstanding. The weeks that followed brought a new kind of peace to the ranch. The tension that had hung over the dirt road like a heavy cloud seemed to finally fade. The neighbors, who once wondered if they should listen to Linda's sharp warnings, now greeted Mark and Emily with warmer smiles and nods of respect. It was as though the truth had opened their eyes. They realized that the quiet couple who worked the land with steady hands and gentle hearts weren't just ranchers. They were people of strength and integrity, people who deserved their place and their peace. For Emily, the change was subtle but noticeable. When she walked through town in her uniform, people greeted her with more familiarity now, some adding, "Chief, I didn't know you lived out by the ranch. We're glad to have you nearby." At first she felt a little awkward with the sudden recognition, but she understood it wasn't about praise. It was about trust. People felt safer knowing she lived close, even if she never spoke of her badge at home. Mark watched all this with quiet pride. He had always known his wife carried more strength than she let on. To him, she was just Emily, the woman who shared coffee with him on the porch every morning, who laughed when the horses nudged her pockets for apples, who carried herself with grace in the middle of storms. But to the community, she was now something more. The reminder that true authority doesn't shout or wave papers in the air. It stands calm and firm, and it speaks only when needed. As for Linda, the fire that had once fueled her daily arguments seemed to sputter. She was still seen walking her dog, binder no longer in hand, but her sharp voice was rarely heard. When she passed by the ranch, she kept her eyes lowered, her steps quick. Some neighbors said she had become embarrassed by the way things unfolded, that the story of calling the cops on her own police chief had spread too far to hide. Others thought she was simply reflecting, realizing that her pride had taken her too far. Emily never gloated, never mocked. She continued to wave politely if their paths crossed, offering kindness without expectation. Mark, too, treated her the same as any other neighbor. They believed in letting the land heal itself, and sometimes people needed that same quiet space to heal their pride. One crisp evening, as autumn deepened and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke, Mark and Emily sat on the porch with mugs of warm coffee. The sky above them glowed with the last colors of sunset, while the first stars peeked through the fading light. Mark leaned back, his chair creaking softly, and looked out over the land they had worked so hard to keep. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I think this place feels different now, not just for us, but for everyone around us." Emily tilted her head, curious. "How so?" "It's like," he paused, searching for the right words. "It's like people finally see the ranch for what it is. Not just some land on the edge of their neighborhood, not just a road they can use when they want, but something that belongs to us, something we've poured ourselves into, and they respect it now." Emily smiled softly. "Respect takes time.
Sometimes it takes standing firm.
But once it's earned, it lasts." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the crickets and the distant call of an owl. The world felt peaceful again, and in that peace, there was a quiet lesson. Emily thought back to the day Linda had called the police, the way the officers had looked at her with surprise before standing tall in respect. She remembered the moment the neighbors had realized the truth, the shift in their eyes when they saw her not just as a ranch wife, but as the chief, and she remembered the way Linda's binder had slowly sagged in her arms, the weight of false authority giving way to the strength of real truth. She didn't feel anger when she thought of it. She felt a kind of compassion. She had met many people in her career who clung to rules and control because they were afraid of losing something, afraid of being overlooked, afraid of not mattering. Maybe that was Linda too. Maybe behind the sharp words and the binder full of papers was just a woman who wanted to feel important. "Do you think she'll try again?" Mark asked suddenly, breaking into her thoughts. Emily shook her head. "No, not like before. She knows now. And even if she doesn't admit it out loud, she's learned something. We all have." Mark nodded, satisfied. "Good, because I'd rather spend my days fixing fences and feeding cattle than arguing with HOA binders." Emily laughed, the sound soft and warm. "That makes two of us." The ranch lights flickered on as the evening deepened, casting a golden glow across the porch. The couple sat together, the simple rhythm of their life stronger than any storm that had passed. The dirt road, once the center of so much noise, now lay quiet under the starlight, as if it too had found peace. Over time, the story became something neighbors told with a shake of their heads and a quiet chuckle. "Remember when Linda called the cops on the police chief?" they'd say, and laughter would follow. But the laughter wasn't cruel. It was the kind of humor that reminded people not to jump to conclusions, not to underestimate the quiet ones, and never to misuse authority for pride. Emily never told the story herself. When people asked about it, she'd smile politely and change the subject. For her, the story wasn't about winning or embarrassing someone else. It was about patience, respect, and the strength of standing calmly in truth. Months later, as winter settled in and the first snow dusted the pastures, Mark and Emily stood side by side watching their horses trot through the white field. The air was cold, their breaths visible in the frosty evening, but their hearts were warm. The ranch was still theirs, still strong, still a place of peace, and no matter what storms came, whether from weather, work, or neighbors, they knew they would face them the same way they had faced Linda's challenge. Together, with patience, truth, and quiet strength. And so the ranch stood, not just as a piece of land, but as a lesson written in soil and sky. A lesson that authority is not about loud voices or binders of rules, but about respect, kindness, and dignity. A lesson that true strength doesn't need to shout. It speaks softly, stands firm, and lets the truth shine brighter than pride. As the stars filled the night sky, Emily reached for Mark's hand and he squeezed hers gently. The world around them was calm again and their hearts were at rest. Whatever stories the neighbors told, whatever whispers passed from porch to porch, the truth remained simple. The ranch was their home, and nothing could take away the peace they had built together.